right, everybody, let's get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. My name is Chris. I'm curator for the Daily Planet Theater here in the museum and your host every week for the Lunchtime Discovery Series. Thanks so much for coming out. Hope that you're enjoying your visit to the museum today or to your offices, as it were, whether that's here in the museum or over in the Department of Environmental Quality. Who, by the way, DEQ partners with the museum every week to host this lecture. The North Carolina Office of Environmental Education within DEQ works with our guest speakers, invites them, brings them in, and then us here at the museum have a great space and team to be able to host and promote these shows. So we're very grateful for the collaboration and partnership that we have with the EE office to put on what's turned out to be an incredible lineup of programs for you every single week. And of course, don't forget, if you hear about a Lunchtime Discovery presentation, but you can't make it into the theater, you can go back after the show and watch it online. If you want more information about how to do that, just find me, Lisa, or Marty afterwards. We can point you in the right direction. Today's program, we have guest speaker, Dr. Jud Kenworthy. He's with the Albemarle-Pamlico National Estuary Partnership to talk a little bit about aquatic submerged vegetation. I'm going to learn more about what that is with this talk. Human activities and climate change, at least a little bit. So, please put your hands together and welcome to the stage, Dr. Jud Kenworthy.
Thanks, Chris. And thank you all for coming and taking time out of your day, and everyone that's on the virtual feed. I thank you as well. And I want to particularly thank the staff of the museum and the opportunity to present this to you today. And one of my goals in my talk today is obviously going to have you leave the room or leave your computers wherever you are and gain a better appreciation of a very important and very unique natural resource that we have here in North Carolina. That resource I'm going to talk about is submerged aquatic vegetation. So during my talk today, you're going to hear submerged aquatic vegetation. You're going to hear the acronym SAV, which is for submerged aquatic vegetation. And then I'm also going to use the term seagrass. And all these terms are interchangeable. We're talking about vascular plants that live underwater, completely submerged, and mostly out of sight, but not out of mind. And hopefully when you leave today, we'll have SAV in your mind and you can take that out to the world, to your friends and to the kids in your classes and educate them as to the importance of this resource. Now SAV, they live in lakes, they live in rivers, they live in little streams, farm ponds, they live in our sounds, they live in the estuaries, and they live in the open ocean. What I'm going to do today, though, is really talk about just the ones that live in our sounds and our estuaries. There just isn't enough time to cover all the diversity of SAV that live in our lakes and in our streams. So I think any of you who've been to the coast at any time, you really can, I think we'll all agree it's pretty beautiful. And of course, the first thing you see for vegetation on the coastline are salt marshes. They're one of the most prominent features. They jump out right in front of you. They're beautiful. It's a great place to go birding. It's also a great place to go fishing if you kind of snake up one of the tidal creeks in the marsh. But if you wait around long enough for the tide to turn, underneath that veneer of water, you're going to find a lot of SAV. And what it is to the naked eye from the surface in that previous slide is it's an invisible resource. But if you wait around, if you put on a mask or a snorkel and mask and get in the water and wait around, you'll actually find a lot of SAV on the coastline of North Carolina. In fact, we think that we have about anywhere from 130 to 150,000 acres of this habitat in our estuaries and in our sounds. We've been trying to map it for several years. It's a really difficult resource to map because it's underwater. And in some areas, the water's pretty turbid, so the resource itself isn't very visible. There's some areas where the water's very clear, and you can see it just standing on the shoreline. Now, whether you realize it or not, this resource that I'm talking about today belongs to all of us. And it belongs to all of us because the state of North Carolina manages their natural resources, those resources that belong to the state, under what we refer to as the public trust doctrine. That means that anything that belongs to the state in submerged lands under the high tide mark, that's everything underwater, with few exceptions. It belongs to everyone in this room, everyone out there listening on their computers. This is a resource that you and I can enjoy. And we can enjoy all the benefits of what this resource produces for us. And this isn't a consideration that's done in a vacuum. All over the world, SAV are recognized as a valuable and important resource. So North Carolina has simply taken this public trust doctrine and applied it to managing this resource. And the outcome of this is that we have a coastal habitat protection plan, and where North Carolina has designated 6 resources, 6 aquatic resources as vital habitats. And one of those you see up on the slide here, the second one from the left, is submerged aquatic vegetation. Subsequently, the recognition by the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan has percolated into conservation plans like the one that APNEP has, the Comprehensive Management Plan for the coast of North Carolina. It also percolates into rules and regulations that we apply to protect this resource. So it's important that you realize this resource belongs to you, so go out and enjoy it. There's another side to this coin, though, and something that I hope you'll leave with today. And that is that this resource belongs to all of us, but if you live near the coastline or in one of the watersheds that affects the coastline, your activities are going to affect this resource. And it's just simply a basic law of physics. Everything flows downhill. Water flows from uplands to our estuaries. And if you live in Rocky Mount, or if you live in Raleigh, or if you live in Kinston, you fertilize your lawn, you flush your toilet, you know, some of that eventually is going to get into the waters that end up flowing into our estuaries and sounds. So this resource that belongs to you, that you can enjoy, we all should also be thinking about how we can be responsible citizens and protect this resource. And I'll come back to this subject a little later on in my talk. This is just a map of the watersheds you can see here, over there on the right-hand side. This is the APNEP watershed, the Albemarle-Pamlico National Estuary. And just look how far back those watersheds go. I mean, everything up in here eventually can affect everything down here. So just be aware of that as you carry on your daily lives. So I think the best place to start in getting you acquainted with SAV is to compare them to some of the other common plants in our estuaries. The first one on the left there, the plankton or the microscopic algae. These are the little tiny single-celled organisms. They spend most of their time in the water. They're very important for primary productivity. They're an important food source for small animals. They're kind of the base of the food web in the water column. And they usually are not a problem. But in some cases, when we deliver too many nutrients to our waters, we can get plankton bloom. So the water will turn green, and then you'll see them. Typically, you won't even notice them at all. Sometimes the water will turn red or brown, and then we might have a problem. These are what we call harmful algal blooms with tiny microscopic red algae and brown algae. The other major plant in our estuary is the macroalgae. And, and these are larger algae. They can be tall, they can be flat, they can be filamentous. They grow attached to surfaces and substrates. They'll attach to pilings. They'll attach to the bottom of your boat. They'll even attach to the leaves of a submerged aquatic plant. And these come in 3 different varieties. The green algae shown here. Commonly, you might see that leaf lettuce type algae in the estuary. That's called Ova lactuca. They come in filamentous forms. They can be attached to a surface, or they can roll around like tumbleweed, or they can get tangled into the meadows of SAV. But they're important producers, and again, as long as we don't deliver too much in the way of nitrogen and phosphorus into our estuaries, these algae are generally very useful and very productive and very important. Now, vascular plants, these submerged vascular plants. These plants are very different than the algae. And the reason that they're different is, number one, they have vascular systems, which the algae don't have. But number two, they have roots and rhizomes, and they grow in the sediment. They anchor and root to the substrate that they're growing on top of, which the algae don't do. The algae just simply glue themselves to a surface, or tumble around, or float around, or get transported by currents. So this is a very, very important difference. And what this leads to is a whole lot of important processes and functions which make submerged aquatic vegetation so critical to our estuaries. Now, of course, we all know about chlorophyll. That's that miraculous molecule that plants have that photosynthesize. In the process of photosynthesizing, they take up carbon dioxide out of the water, which is equilibrated with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. They fix that into mass, their leaves, their roots, their rhizomes, and at the same time they produce oxygen. While they're doing all that, they can only do it if they have nutrients. So they take up nitrogen, they take up phosphorus, they take up other trace elements. So they're constantly cycling nutrients in the water. But because they have a vascular system, much like land plants, they can actually transport those nutrients and that oxygen to the sediment and actually aerate the sediment. They can release organic matter in the sediment. At the same time, because they have roots, they take up nutrients in the sediment. And then they can translocate those nutrients into the leaves, and that can end up into the food web, and eventually gets recycled in the water column or taken up again by the plants. So really, you can think of SAV as a biological wastewater treatment plant. You know, they're doing that service for us for free. So they're important in keeping the waters clean and removing a lot of the nutrients that are in the water. Now, the second thing they do in this whole process is they have that canopy of leaves. That canopy of leaves is projected up into the water, and that exerts a frictional force on the water. So when water's moving and contacting those blades, the canopy actually slows the water motion. The result of that is that particles in the water settle out in and around the SAV meadow. So they actually trap sediments. At the same time, that canopy prevents sediments from being resuspended and eroded. So not only do they trap sediments, they actually accumulate sediments. And you can see in this next photograph right here, on the right-hand side, or on your right-hand side, that's a meadow of seagrass. To the left is an unvegetated bottom, and you can actually see the elevation that that seagrass meadow is above the sediment around it. So they can actually build up the bottom. They can create shoals. They can stabilize shoals. So they're actually processing the particles in the water, and they're retaining them inside their canopy. The other thing that they can do by this process is they can actually deflect waves that are passing through. So waves come in from offshore and pass through that meadow, heading to the shoreline. They're actually attenuated, so they can protect the shorelines physically. One of the most interesting things about submerged aquatic vegetation is the fact that they've actually evolved from land plants. The steps that got us to SAV wasn't some step from the early algal ancestors, but actually the submerged vegetation we see today, we're pretty confident based on molecular techniques, the sequencing of DNA, that we can identify the ancestors of these plants. And they actually came from land plants. And because they came from land plants, they had made some pretty significant adaptations to live underwater. So the first clue we have to that is that all of our SAV are flowering plants. And so we knew this for a long time. We knew this long before we were able to sort of probe the DNA of these plants that we have today to really understand what their ancestors were. We knew that they were flowering plants, so that was a big clue that they had to come from ancestors that were angiosperms. But the big difference between flowering plants in the water and flowering plants on land is that there's no biological vectors for the transfer of pollen from the male flower to the female flower. All of this is done physically underwater. We call it hydrophilous pollination. So you don't see those exotic, colorful flowers like you see in land plants to attract pollinators. What you see are plain, simple, physically designed so that they can release pollen in the water and they can capture pollen underwater. There's a few species of SAV in fresh water, and there's one in seawater that actually transport their pollen on the surface, but it's quite rare. Most of the pollination actually goes on underwater. Eventually they produce fruits and they produce seeds, and this is this is sort of the developmental stages of one of our common seagrasses here in North Carolina, eelgrass. You can see the seed on the left, the cotyledon developing, and then eventually you get a shoot and a small seedling. And then if you go out in the field and look at that, you can see all those little individual patches around the two folks there in the slide. Those are seedlings that germinated in the winter. They probably germinated in December. This photo was taken in March. And what you see there is individual seedlings that have grown during those few months of ideal conditions. Eventually, you can see how that spread across this entire flat. This particular seagrass bed, it regenerates every year completely by seed. And then a month or two later, this is what it looks like. So in 6 months, you can go from basically a unvegetated sand flat to a dense, thick meadow of submerged aquatic vegetation. And that's all because these plants have flowers and produce seeds. And this is a really important process in our system. I'll talk about it a little more in a couple of minutes. Now, some other adaptations that are really interesting and are useful to know for submerged aquatic vegetation is that if you compare SAV to land plants, there's a whole lot less woody tissue. In fact, there's almost no woody tissue. Even the rhizomes are not woody. They're stiff, they're thick, but they're not anything like the tissue that we see in land plants, the trunks and the stems and these hard structures that elevate the plants above the ground. SAV have a very reduced amount of that, and what they produce is more leafy tissue than non-photosynthetic tissue. And one of the reasons for that is that because water is so much more dense than air, you need to be flexible underwater instead of being rigid. When those forces of that much higher density of water strike a surface, those forces are a lot stronger than wind. So instead of being tall and stiff, they're small and flexible. And that way they can bend in the current and they can bend back and forth in the waves. The other thing is, that because they live underwater, they have much less light than land plants have. So as sunlight comes through the surface of the water and starts to penetrate the water at depth, it's attenuated really, really fast. So light underwater is very much reduced compared to light on land. So adaptively, it's much better to have more photosynthetic tissue than non-photosynthetic tissue. The other thing about SAV that's different than land plants is they don't have any stomata. These are the tiny little holes that you find in the leaves of land plants where all of the gas, how they communicate the gases in and out of the plants. SAV don't have stomata, and you can imagine, it's not a good idea to have a whole bunch of holes in your leaves if you're living underwater. The other thing that SAV have that's very different than land plants is they have these very large gas vacuoles. We call them lacunae. And these lacunae, of course, are the place where they store the gases that they produce during photosynthesis and respiration. And one of the functions of those gases is buoyancy. So those leaves are flexible and they can bend over, but when they fill them up with gas, they stand upright. So they're much better off standing upright where they can intercept the water, take up nutrients, and also intercept light. Now, the other important thing about these lacunae is when they're photosynthesizing, they're producing oxygen, it's stored in these lacunae, and these lacunae and the vascular system pump the oxygen down into the roots and rhizomes. And this is probably one of the most critical and important things that I'm going to say about SAV plant physiology. These plants live in an environment where the metabolism in the sediment, in these water-saturated sediments in our estuaries, most of the metabolism is anaerobic metabolism. And one of the byproducts of anaerobic metabolism is a compound called hydrogen sulfide. And hydrogen sulfide is a phytotoxin, and it kills plants. So these plants are living literally at the threshold of life and death every minute of their lives, because that functional root and rhizome system is growing in what could potentially be a highly toxic environment. Just imagine yourself living, at the edge of a swimming pool filled with hydrochloric acid, and at any moment you could fall in there. I mean, it's a crude analogy, but that's, believe it or not, these plants are living at the edge. And if they aren't producing enough oxygen, they're not going to survive. So photosynthesis is important, the ability to transport it there is important, and it's also important that we maintain the quality of the water such that they can photosynthesize. So this is one of the most important kind of physiological things to know about these plants. And I'll come back to it in a minute or so. So you're probably wondering, how do you go from plant physiology to a bottlenose dolphin and a toadfish and an SAV meadow? Well, scientists have told us that probably about 70 to 80% of the diet of bottlenose dolphin are animals that make sound. So, we know dolphins from the sounds that they make, but they also can receive sounds. And the way they hunt prey is they listen for prey. And there's a lot of animals out there that make noise, believe it or not. In fact, there's a whole new field of ecology that we call acoustic ecology. And if you ever get a chance and you're down by the water and you're near an oyster reef, you know, stick your head in the water and listen. The sound is amazing. Now, this critter in the lower left-hand corner there, that ugly-looking fish is a toadfish. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with toadfish, but they're one of the fishes in our estuaries that make sound. And of course, you know, drum makes sound, red drum, boom, boom, you know, that's where that name came from. You got croakers, you've got snapping shrimp, lots of shellfish make sounds. It's, you know, it's just amazing. There's a whole acoustic world out there, things making sounds. Well, dolphin key in on those sounds, and that's how one of the ways they hunt and find their prey. So up in the left-hand corner is a regular fish finder. And if you take a fish, hook it up to a transducer and point it at the bottom, you can actually detect submerged aquatic vegetation. And the reason that you can detect submerged aquatic vegetation is because the plant mass and all the gas in that plant mass, when that sonar beam hits it, it's reflected back. And you can see it in the slide there. And the top is just an illustration of vegetation in a boat passing over. The actual echogram from that sounder in the little box there is showing you the actual signal from the submerged aquatic vegetation. Now, two points here. One is, you can imagine, what's the best place a predator could hide? I mean, if you look back, that toadfish would be camouflaged inside all of that acoustic noise. So there are some scientists who actually believe that some of the prey of these sound-detecting organisms like dolphin actually will hide from predation by camouflaging themselves in a submerged aquatic vegetation meadow. For us, we use this technology to actually map SAV. This is a tool we're beginning to use, especially in areas in our estuaries where the water is not very clear. We can actually put one of these systems on a vessel, drive around, and actually map the submerged aquatic vegetation just based on their sonar signal. And typically the way we map these habitats is we put a camera on some type of aircraft. In this case, this is an oblique shot from a low altitude drone flight. That's Back Sound, North Carolina. Way up in the background is Beaufort Inlet, and all that marshland there is the Rachel Carson National Estuarine Research Reserve. And the front of it, those dark areas, all you see underneath the water there are the submerged aquatic vegetation. So in clear water, we can photograph it from the air. In fact, we can put cameras on fixed-wing aircraft at higher altitudes, point it down vertically, and we can very accurately map the seagrass. So you can see this marsh island right here at the top of the slide, and all this dark area down here. This is the submerged aquatic vegetation. So that's how we map it. And in a few minutes, I'm going to show you some of the maps that we've generated from that. Oh, there it is right there. This is a composite map of submerged aquatic vegetation that we have for North Carolina. And there's a couple things I want you to take home from this map. You can see to the east are the barrier islands, and then you can see Pamlico Sound there in the middle. You notice, one thing you notice from this photograph is that the green, which is the SAV, there's a lot more green to the east than there is to the west. And the reason for that mainly is the fact that we can map that. The water's a lot clearer, it's shallow enough, we can fly aircraft over it. So for several decades, we've been able to build a sort of library of photographs and maps that depict the area in that part of our system. The lack of green to the west in the rivers like the Neuse River, the Pamlico River, and Albemarle Sound, those are areas that are very difficult to map with aerial sensors. So these are the areas now that we're working in using sonar to try to get a better idea of how much vegetation is back there. So the lack of green back there doesn't necessarily mean there isn't much green back there, but it could, and I'll return to that in a minute. So there's two things that, that sort of affect that map I just showed you, one of which is a salinity gradient. And the map on the left-hand side there is a composite map of a whole lot of data that was assembled by some of the staff at the Institute of Marine Science at the University of North Carolina in a project called SailWise. So the data that you see there for salinity is data that's been harvested from a whole bunch of different sources and kind of put in a composite. So it's kind of a general pattern of what our salinity is in our sounds and estuaries in North Carolina. And what you see on the very bright colors, the reds and the yellows, those are the higher salinities. So the closer you get to the Atlantic Ocean, the saltier the water is. That's because we have inlets that are exchanging water between the sounds and the ocean. To the west, in the Neuse River and the Pamlico River, and to the north in Albemarle Sound, you see the blue colors. And those are the much lower salinities. That's because less seawater gets that far and there's more water coming down those rivers. And what that salinity gradient leads to is an SAV community in our estuaries that really has dual personality. And that dual personality is there are plants that prefer high salinity, we call them seagrasses, and then there are plants that prefer low salinity. There's a whole lot more species in our system that prefer low salinity, and you can see those on the graph there. On the x-axis, you have salinity, and on the y-axis, you have the species that occur in North Carolina. And of course, you can see the third one down, the really interesting one, that's Rupia marittima. And that's a species that tolerates salinity from freshwater to hypersaline conditions. It can grow in 60 parts per thousand. It can grow in freshwater. So it has a large range of salinity tolerance. The two species at the top are seagrasses. They have a much narrower and higher optimum, and the rest of the species prefer lower salinities. The other factor that plays a big role in our SAV communities in North Carolina is this this situation where we exist at what is called a biogeographic transition zone. And this biogeographic transition zone is just simply the convergence of the Gulf Stream bringing warm tropical waters to the north and the laboratory current bringing cold temperate waters to the south. And we exist right on this boundary. And that has a big effect on what lives and grows in our waters in North Carolina. And the tendency is slightly more tropical than it is temperate, but we do get a mix of species. And that too applies to our SAV. So you look at those top three species on the graph there. The top species, Haliduli rhydi, it's a tropical species. It grows from here at its northern limit all the way to the equator in Brazil. The bottom species, Zostra marina, which we commonly call eelgrass, it grows from here all the way to the Arctic Circle. So we have a situation where these two species with different affinities grow together. And then we have Rupia, which is the wild card here. This one grows all over the world, temperate waters, tropical waters. It grows in fresh water, and it grows in salt water. So what we end up with, this range overlap, is Zostra being real abundant in the spring and early summer, Haliduli being real abundant in the summer and late summer, and then you add rupia to it, where we have seagrass communities where these species co-occur, you can literally get SAV present all year long. It kind of buffers the seasonality, which you see. If you were to go into a temperate SAV bed, say in New England, you know, you'd see great growth in the summer and then virtually nothing in the wintertime. Whereas we have a really extended period where these three species co-occur. So, what does that mean for climate change? Of course, you know, there's lots of different scenarios proposed in the future for climate change. A couple of them that may be really important for North Carolina to think about. The first thing I want to point out is that most of the waters in the middle of our sounds is very deep. So one of the reasons you don't see green out there in the middle of Pamlico Sound is because the water's 20 feet deep. And these plants are really mostly restricted to less than 6 feet or 2 meters. There simply isn't enough light at any deeper depths to allow these plants to grow. So one of the questions for the future in climate change is, you know, what's going to happen as temperature rises, if it rises, and what's going to happen if salinity increases as sea level rises? What's going to happen to these species? Well, you might think about their affinities and, you know, whether or not these plants can actually grow in these changing environments. Think about the tropical and the temperate species competing with one another. If temperatures rise, you might predict, well, that tropical species is going to do better than that temperate species. In fact, there was a recent paper published in a fairly prestigious scientific journal that is predicting that eelgrass will be extirpated in North Carolina by the end of this century, if not sooner. You know, whether you can believe that or not, I mean, it is debatable, but people are thinking about that. Now, remember earlier I talked about flowering and seed production? So just putting forward kind of a scenario. So the water's warming. If the water warms, you might predict that that tropical species will win out in the future. But that tropical species does not flower in North Carolina. The temperate species does flower. And part of the result of that flowering and that seed production is it enables it to regenerate its population every year. So it gets real hot in the summer and eelgrass dies back. But in that growing period prior to the thermal stress, it produces a whole bunch of seeds. Those seeds reside in the sediment. And then next winter, when the water temperatures are more optimum, the seeds sprout and the meadow regenerates. That tropical plant does not flower in North Carolina. We don't know why, but I've been working in the coastal waters in North Carolina for 45 years, and we've found one flower, and we've never found seeds, and we've never found seedlings. So when the water warms, the question is, you know, are those tropical plants going to be able to disperse across that deep water? Say it gets saltier in the western part of the sound. You know, is Haliduli going to be able to migrate across Albemarle Sound and live in that higher salinity waters on the inner banks or up in Albemarle Sound or the mouth of the Neuse River? So there's some really interesting scenarios to think about in the future. So what I'm going to do now for a couple of minutes is just go through a few slides and show you why SAV is important. I've told you a little bit about some aspects of its biology and its distribution, and then I think most people always ask me when I talk to them is, you know, why do we even care about SAV? Well, it's a habitat. It's a place where animals live. And it's amazing how many animals actually live and use SAV habitats. It's food. Animals eat it. Believe it or not, there are dozens of herbivores that actually consume the vegetation that grows in an SAV meadow. They eat the SAV. Hitting that button. There's ducks and geese, there's sea urchins. There are endangered species like green turtles. I know, and I think one of the possibilities in the future is we're going to have a lot more green turtles in North Carolina, given the success in the nesting beaches that we're hearing about, especially this year. And believe it or not, there's manatees in North Carolina. And we may be seeing more manatees in the future. And these are large herbivores that eat SAV. SAV is a place to eat other things. So a lot of animals use SAV beds because they produce a lot of the types of food that they eat. I mentioned the dolphin earlier and the toadfish. You've got literally hundreds of species that are food for larger animals. They're kind of the base of the food web. They're also popular places for wading birds where they eat. SAV is also just a surface, a substrate. And if any of you have ever owned a boat and neglected painting the bottom, or you didn't paint it enough, you discover, pretty quickly in the summertime that bottom gets fouled. If you put out a crab trap, if you put out anything in the water. I mean, I probably couldn't come up with a number to estimate how many animals and plants that live in the water, they really want to be attached to something. Everything wants to be attached to something. And so you put a dense canopy of SAV out in the water and everything likes to attach to it. So as a substrate, you can see that snail there crawling on that SAV leaf. It's a place to attach, but it's actually eating the microplankton or the small, tiny microorganisms that they themselves have attached to the leaf blade. And of course, we know that sea scallops in a certain part of their life stage actually utilize the attachment process, and it's vital to them to survive. It's a place to hide. This is the nursery concept. All these little fish and shellfish and other organisms, they can duck into this canopy and be invisible to the predators. So it's an important shelter especially for young organisms and juveniles. And then of course, it's a place to fish. And Native Americans, colonists, all throughout our existence in the coast, we've utilized SAV. You can go back into historical records and see where fishermen have talked about the weed, fishing in the weed. And what they were really talking about is fishing in the grass beds where lots of fish occur. Then of course, for you and I and most of us, recreational fishing is a joy. And many of the species that we catch in North Carolina, at some point in their lifetime, are either depending on or at least utilizing SAV habitat during their life stage while they're in our estuary. So, I often get the question when I'm talking to people about economic value of SAV. And it turns out sometimes to be quite a debate. In fact, it's a rabbit hole, really. And I often try to avoid it, but you can't because people want to know. Everybody's putting dollar values on things. And, I'll throw a couple numbers up here, and, we can debate them. And, but, they're real numbers, and, their ranges can vary depending on where you are and what you're thinking, but they are valuable. That fishing and recreation value of $20,000 per acre per year, that can really translate in North Carolina when you take all the acres to, on the order of $1 billion per year. In the same way with that nutrient purification process, very difficult to assign numbers to it, but people have tried, and that's one number up there, 17,000 per acre. And that, again, translates into hundreds of millions of dollars when you consider the acreage that we have out there. So it is valuable economically. But I kind of look at value in a different way, and I think an important way. And To me, one of the issues that's often lost in the discussion of the value is this cost of replacement. What does it actually cost to replace it if we lose it? And this is a value, I don't know what to call it other than cost of replacement. But it's something that's often ignored. It's not included in the conversation. Again, you know, these plants are living at the edge. And when we look around the world, what we've seen in our sort of meta-analysis of what's going on with SAV ecosystems, there is a lot of impairment and loss of these systems. In fact, the global rate of loss that we estimated a few years ago from a meta-analysis was about 1.8% per year on a global scale, with local scales being on the order of 8 to 12% per year. And in some systems, we've completely lost our SAV. So these plants that are living on the edge, when we impair their water quality, which turns out to be the #1 issue globally for the impairment and loss of SAV meadows. We've had that happen with our neighbors in the Chesapeake Bay. We're having it happen right now in the Indian River Lagoon in Florida, where, you know, what was once 90,000 acres of seagrass has almost all vanished. So we've identified some of the problems. And we've also learned through some other meta-analyses that our ability to restore these, the success rate of restoring these globally, is about 36%. When you look at all the published and reported restoration projects around the world that could be reached and examined, the success rate is less than a coin toss. You know, you could go to Las Vegas and play blackjack and expect to have better luck than you can. The other thing is that putting plants in the ground, restoring SAV beds is really, really expensive. And the numbers exceed those numbers I put up there earlier about actual value that we get from seagrass beds or SAV beds. So this idea about the cost of replacement factored into our consideration of cost is very, very important. So I'm going to try to close on a high note here. If you look, this is a little conceptual model that was prepared by one of my colleagues a few years ago, and it kind of shows what happens when we load more nutrients and sediments into an estuary or one of our sounds. So moving from left to right there in the middle, that's optimum habitat. Clear water, the right balance of nutrients. As you move further to the right, as you eutrify the water, as you add more nutrients, you add more sediments, you begin to impair photosynthesis. Eventually, you end up with something other than SAV. And this is kind of the conceptual model we work with. Now, North Carolina, like a few minutes ago, I said, you know, we've got systems over here already. We've got a lot of systems teetering right here. Now, if you look at North Carolina, what we've got for our high salinity SAV, that massive amount of green that I showed you on the map, we're right here. It's in pretty good shape. What we're not sure of is how far we're this way with our low salinity SAV. And the problem is we don't have a good historical baseline to work with. We have anecdotal information, suggestions that we may have already lost half of it, but it's really hard to document. And we're kind of racing the clock here in our attempts to map this resource and monitor it. We're not sure how much there was when maybe times were better. We are sure that we have some serious water quality problems in our rivers, in our sounds. We know that. I mean, it's going on right now in Albemarle Sound. The tributaries with their blue-green algae blooms. We have a history of blooms in the Neuse River. So there are, clearly identified water quality problems. So again, we have this dual personality of habitat, and we may actually have a dual personality of issues or problems that we have to deal with. Now, the good news is that there are case studies and examples around the world where we can reverse this. And it's been done. Tampa Bay is a perfect example. Right now in Europe, there's a number of places where clearly that once we start managing the system, once we manage for good water quality, we can reverse the trend and start going from right to left. But we have to be really careful because, right there, if we get right there, it may be a tipping point. Can we get back? The further we go to the right, the harder we go back, the harder it is to go back, and the more expensive it is, because we're not only talking about putting plants in the ground, we're talking about engineering the environment, controlling groundwater flux, controlling stormwater flux, controlling the amount of nutrients that come into our estuaries. So if we're here right now in our high salinity estuaries, we need to make sure we stay there. And if we're leaning this way in our low salinity estuaries, we need to start to pay attention to figure out what we can do to turn the tide for that. So I'll close with just one comment, and that is, if we all take a little responsibility, we might be able to tip the scale. So.
Thank you very much. We've got a few minutes for questions if you've got time.
Yeah.
So, we've got lots of questions. Let's just roll with it.
Okay, so I have a question with tipping the scales and about saying as an individual, if we're more aware of our choices, do you think that lands on an individual so much as more of policymakers who aren't implementing policy that can reduce nutrients going into the sound?
I think it's the bottom up. I think collectively individuals matter. It matters at the voting booth. It matters whether you go to public meetings and express your opinion, write letters, go to organizations like APNEP that welcome volunteer help, welcome improvements. So I think not any single individual is going to make a difference, but a lot of individuals will make a difference. So, your voice is as important as anyone else's. Your ideas are as important. And, where there are opportunities to share your individual ideas and opinions, they're valuable.
Thank you.
I have a question about global warming and rising sea levels. How will that affect the SAVs? Will they start moving further west when it's deeper water and when the water is shallower a little further to the west? Do we start seeing some of that kind of movement?
So what I was trying to illustrate in that slide is that to move west, you've got to cross that deep water. So they're not going to migrate west on the bottom. They're going to have to be somehow dispersed in the water. And, quite frankly, that could be a real challenge for them. And considering that it's possible that in that whole process, everything west is going to get saltier, well, those species that are there now that are adapted to those low salinity environments, it's not going to be good for them. So, the hope is that those high salinity plants will somehow disperse to the west and actually colonize and occupy the space that might be lost by those low salinity species.
All right, others, I'm going to look up. If you're on the second or third floors, wave at me. You can ask questions too. If not, I guess I'll have the last one. How are SAVs important for stemming climate change? Are seagrass beds Do they sequester a lot of carbon? Does losing them release a lot of carbon?
Yeah, I apologize for skipping over that. One of my little physiology slides, of course, when they fix CO2, that CO2 is equilibrated from the atmosphere. That, when they fix it and produce carbohydrates and they're all their structural materials, some of that is in the sediment, buried. And it is quite possible that carbon is sequestered in beneath the plants. And as long as that sediment's stable, you can really think about it as a sequestration process, because it decomposes very slowly in that anaerobic environment. So there is a lot of interest in the ability of SAV, especially some types of tropical species of seagrass, to sequester large amounts of carbon. But one other thing, we do know that from our studies, we use special tools to look at the isotopic composition of the organic matter in the sediment that's buried there that could be sequestered. So far, it looks like more than at least half of it comes from outside the seagrass bed. So they're not only sequestering their own carbon, they're able to, by trapping organic matter in sediments and holding it there and burying it, they take carbon produced in other systems like upstream in the watershed or from the marsh or even from offshore in the ocean and sequester it.
Let's give Dr. Kenworthy one more round of applause.
Thanks.
Thanks for being here today.
Yeah,
Thanks for
welcome.
sharing. And hey, thanks to all of you for coming out. Hope we'll see you again soon. Of course, we won't be here next week because next week, right up against that Thanksgiving holiday, so there won't be a Lunchtime Discovery next Wednesday, but I believe right after that, we'll be back here in the Daily Planet Theater at noon. So we'll see you then. Have a great time, everybody. Bye.